Our next class is 2 weeks from today because next Monday is a holiday for most of the university. The subject today is how a knowledge economy for the few can be turned into a knowledge economy for the many. This is one of the central themes of a progressive political economy. Let me situate you in the general plan. I have argued that there are three subjects that are of decisive importance to a progressive project in political economy. The first is the relation between the vanguard of production and the rest of the economy, the subject that we're discussing now. The second is the relation of labor to capital, and the third is the relation of finance to production or to the real economy. Of course, most of the actual conversation in politics is focused on fiscal and monetary policy and on the attempt to humanize the established market order by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. And I devoted part of the last class to a discussion of the proper view of that problem and its proper place in a political economy that gives sovereign importance to the structural issues and treats the issue of compensatory redistribution as accessory to reconstruction. Now, the place to begin this discussion about the transformation of an insular knowledge economy into an inclusive one is to remind ourselves of why the knowledge economy appears to be insular in the first place, why it takes this socially exclusive character that it now assumes in the world. And I suggested before two sets of reasons that we might give for this insularity of the knowledge economy. These reasons are of different degrees of importance. The first, and it seems to me the less significant reason, is that the knowledge economy is contrary to industrial mass production, contrary to its predecessor in the role of the vanguard, not stereotypical. Mass production consisted in a stable, fixed repertoire of machines and capabilities. The knowledge economy doesn't have this character. It does not, or at least does not yet have, this stereotypical character. And mass production was minimalist in its requirements, especially in its educational and institutional requirements. The knowledge economy is maximalist. It demands a great deal. But I don't think that this line of explanation, as it were, this functional explanation, is the most significant. The most significant is that the insular knowledge economy that we have is a characteristic example of what I called the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is the path that allows us to accommodate an innovation or a set of innovations, the innovations that constitute the knowledge economy, to the prevailing interests and ideas in the world. It is, in other words, the result of a massive downsizing of potential. And because it lends itself to such a downsizing, because it can be accommodated to the ruling interest and the established preconceptions, it becomes all the more attractive. In other words, what seems to be a limitation is part of its causal force. An eloquent example of this susceptibility of the knowledge economy to downsizing in the form of insularity is the way in which it lends itself to what I earlier described as a bifurcation of the process of production between the creative and lucrative core, which its masters retain, and the commoditized or routinized secondary part, which they can then subcontract to firms and workers in remote parts of the world. The succession of conventional industry and the insular knowledge economy as vanguards of production has been accompanied in the world by a momentous shift in the world division of labor. The world division of labor that was the basis of conventional trade theory was trade between the advanced economies that are capital intensive and the developing economies that were labor intensive. That basis of the international division of labor is now being subtly transformed and replaced by another basis in which the commanding force in the knowledge economy becomes the network, the connection among all these advanced sectors. Not just in the United States, Germany, Japan, the richest economies, but also in the top tier of developing economies, especially China and India. So on this view, high finance, cosmopolitan finance, sometimes seen as the commanding force in the global economy, becomes instead a sideshow, accessory to the real force. The real force is this cosmopolitan network of the advanced sectors. What then would we require institutionally or programmatically to turn the knowledge economy for a few into a knowledge economy for the many? My central thesis is that there are three sets of requirements. The educational or cognitive requirements, the social or moral requirements, and most importantly, the legal and institutional requirements. The changed legal and institutional architecture of the market economy, which would serve as a basis for this inclusive form of the knowledge economy. So let me begin then today's class by reviewing each of these elements. First of all, the educational requirements. I argued that conventional industry, industrial mass production, in fact, has very modest educational requirements. All it requires, I said, from the workers was elementary literacy to understand numerical or verbal instructions, a disposition to obey, and basic hand-eye coordination. By contrast, the knowledge economy, in all its forms, insular or inclusive, requires a high level of education from the workers. And ideally, to achieve its full potential as a socially inclusive knowledge economy, I want to argue that it requires a very particular kind of education. In countries that are large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States or India or Brazil, it requires as its institutional basis the reconciliation of the local management of the schools by national standards of investment and quality. And to reconcile local management by the states and municipalities with national standards, three instruments are needed. The first is a way of assessing through tests, through evaluations, performance school by school and student by student, because there's no other way of discovering what works and what doesn't work. The second is a mechanism of redistribution of resources and staff from richer places to poor places. You know that in the United States, for example, school finance continues to be based on local municipal finance, so that the poor places are only able to have poor school systems and rich places to have better school systems. And this is, of course, unacceptable from the standpoint of democracy, but unacceptable also if education is to perform its role as a backdrop to the knowledge economy. The quality of the education that a young person receives must not depend on the happenstance of where or to whom it is born. The third instrument is a procedure for correction and turnaround. If, despite all efforts, a local school system continues to fall repeatedly below the minimum level of quality and investment that can be accepted in the country as a whole, there must be a way to intervene, to take it over, to assign its correction to independent experts, and to return it fixed, a procedure of corrective intervention. In a federal system, it wouldn't necessarily be a federal intervention. It would arise as the artifact of a collaboration of the three levels of the federation vertically in confederal bodies that would be empowered to take over temporarily local failing school systems and to turn them around. The general principle which is to be affirmed through such a procedure is that every young person is entitled to a high level of education independently of the happenstance of its birth. Now, of course, this institutional economic basis of education is necessary, but it is not the main point. The main point is the model of teaching and learning which an inclusive knowledge economy would require. And what are the salient characteristics of this model? first conceived of as a model of general education, and then as a model of technical education or vocational training. The first is that the focus must be on the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination, rather than on the mastery of dead information. The aim is not to turn the mind of the student into a mirror of the encyclopedia. What is crucial in every field of knowledge is insight into transformation. The way in which we understand anything is by understanding what it can become. Not what it can become ultimately, but what it can become next. The theirs to which we can get from here, given certain interventions or disruptions. And so the whole focus of education in every field of natural and social study is on the deepening of insight into the actual by the expansion of the imagination of the adjacent possible. The adjacent possible being the penumbra of accessible transformations around the established phenomenon. Now, these capabilities of insight into the accessible transformations and of analysis and synthesis are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They're acquired by dealing with content, but by dealing with content in a particular way, in a way that emphasizes selective depth rather than encyclopedic superficiality. And that's the case for a style of education that is thematically organized or project-oriented. The third characteristic of this style of education is that in its social setting, it must be cooperative. Cooperation is the social method of advanced science, and it should be the method of every form of education from its earliest stages. Cooperation among students, between students and teachers, among teachers, and among schools, in presence and remote. Cooperation as opposed to what prevails in traditional education, which is the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. The fourth characteristic of the style of education is the most important. The fourth characteristic is that education must be dialectical. Every subject, every method, every discipline must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. This is the only way to liberate the mind. And by opposition to the orthodoxies of the university culture. The orthodoxies of the university culture have two main bases. Their first basis is the forced marriage of methods and subject matters. For example, the subject of special interest to us here, economics. Economics is not approached as the study of the economy. It's approached as the study of a method, the method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. Any other way of studying the economy is not regarded as economics. And the application of this method to subjects that seem to have nothing to do with production and exchange is regarded as economics. Or to change the context to natural science. In natural science, fundamental physics, the gold standard in the orthodox hierarchy of the sciences, is regarded as characterized by an anti-historical structural method. By contrast, the study of evolution through Darwinism is approached through a historical method. But didn't we discover in the 1920s that the universe has a history? And if the universe has a history, then every feature of it must be historical. We now know enough to believe that at some point, the basic atomic structure or the subatomic structure did not exist. And the laws, constants, and symmetries that we now supposed to govern the cool-down universe that we inhabit did not yet apply. So these forced methods, forced marriages of method and subject matter that characterize the orthodoxies of the university culture have no solid basis. The second linchpin, the second foundation of these orthodoxies is the denial of the metaphysical or speculative element in science. In the hard sciences, we have the core of empirical findings, and we have theoretical projects, like the projects of Newton and Einstein. But the connection, the bridge from the theoretical frameworks to the interpretation of the empirical findings always depends on some metaphysical conception, like the space-time continuum in Einsteinian physics, or the world of forces and fields in the earlier physics. The whole spirit of the orthodoxies of the university culture is to deny this metaphysical element and to prevent us from understanding that the hard empirical findings of these sciences could be seen in a different way from the perspective of other metaphysical presuppositions. The national curriculums that exist in the world, and the United States is one of the few countries that does not have a national curriculum, are a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. They are the university culture downsized to the level of children, and they induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas in the university for the way things are. So the ultimate objective of this form of education that I have just summarized is to immunize the young against these orthodoxies, to prevent them from being emasculated, as they now are, and prepared for a life of intellectual servility, which they will serve when they reach the higher stages of education. So obviously, this is a program whose ambitions and uses far outreaches the immediate aims of the knowledge economy. And like everything else in this maximalist program that I'm about to outline, it can't be understood as necessitated by the narrower and immediate practices of the knowledge economy. And how could such a program arise in the present societies, in the present states? Obviously, it can't arise, it can't emerge as the work of educational despots at the center of power. It has to be a collective work, the work of hundreds of schools and thousands of teachers. It has to be a national movement, a movement of liberation. As the program of educational reformers has been at different periods in modern history in many countries. So what is the conception in which I say this is not functionally required for the immediate purposes of the knowledge economy? This is required to realize its aims in its most ambitious potential. And that's the sense in which I'm saying it's a maximalist program. Now let me stop and ask for your comments or questions about this first aspect. Yes?
If the current educational system in any given country lacks this characteristic,
Yes.
then how can the minority of the people that work in the knowledge economy live today that insular version of the knowledge economy? How can they develop the skills to be in that insular knowledge economy within this general educational systems that lack this?
Because I think that they train themselves or educate themselves in some lesser version of this maximalist program now. So take the United States. In the United States, there was an educational reformer, John Dewey, who inspired the most important educational innovations in the United States. And Dewey's program resembles several aspects of the program that I've just outlined, even though I've outlined a program that is more radical than his, more expansive, more ambitious in its method. Dewey's program had two parts. One part was analytical problem solving achieved in cooperative dialogue. That has become the program of the elite progressive schools in the United States. The top tier of private schools and also the top tier of public schools in the rich parts of the country or the specialized public schools in large cities. So it is, as it were, a truncated partial version of the program that I just described. And the elite of the knowledge economy builds on that in its own internal discourse. The other part of Dewey's program is the program that the Americans rejected. The other part of Dewey's program was the criticism of established ideas and social practices. That, of course, is the part that they rejected. I have the impression that that rejected part of Dewey's program was replaced by another target. The target was the acquisition of a particular style of sociability, which is regarded as useful or necessary to performance in the American professional and business class. So the young person, the student, is supposed to cast on his fellows a halo of seductive charisma, but at the same time to efface or conceal this charismatic exercise. And this combination of radiance and self-effacement is seen as a priceless requisite to inclusion in the American elites. This is the real object of socialization in these schools, in these elite schools. So there's the cooperative analytical problem solving, and there's this intangible induction into a particular kind of sociability, which I've just described to you. But everyone is present here. You can have your own opinions about whether I'm being accurate or not in the description of this. Yes.
Going back to the reconciliation of local national schools with the national quality standards,
Yes.
why stop at just the national quality standards and not have, other than at the school level, completely nationalized education?
Well, because the problem when you say completely nationalized. So, for example, should the primary schools in countries like the United States be federalized, like as in France, where famously it was said that the minister of education could look at his watch at any time during the day and know what page of Descartes students throughout France were reading, because this is a stranglehold, right? It's inappropriate to a large country with great regional differences and diversities, which wants to profit from its diversity. So it seems to me to be inappropriate to impose on such a country. I think it's inappropriate even in France, and the French are trying to get away from that. But it's certainly inappropriate in these other countries.
When you think about the redistribution element, do you think about that at the national level as opposed to the local level?
Yes, so I think that the schools should not depend on local finance. And if local finance is to play any role at all, there has to be some redistributive counterweight to it that comes through transfers within the federation or from the national government to the states, so that these regional variations in per capita income and wealth are compensated for or annulled. That's the idea. But not at the cost of entirely suppressing the element of variety and diversity in large countries. So it shouldn't become like France.
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge is that the districts, the school district concept can be relatively arbitrary because of its boundaries. So I'm just thinking through, well, what is the level of local that feels appropriate in a place like the United States? Is it a state? Is it a city? Is it a,
Well, I think wouldn't the decisive element be where are the inequalities manifest? So the answer to your question would seem to be it has to be as local as necessary to prevent these drastic inequalities from affirming themselves. Right? Economically. Well, it's not just money. It could be also staff, people, resources. So there should be a national teaching profession. It should have, part of it should have some level of geographic flexibility, so it could be sent from here to there. So this requires then a flexibilization of the federal system. Yes.
So I have two questions. The first one is tied to the one just asked. There are some developing countries like my own where that different curriculums are a product of different level of economic, the people at different levels of economic well-being in the society are able to enjoy or are able to have different sort of curriculums. For instance, there is British curriculum, then there is the local curriculum. And this, I believe, it produces a lot of inequality in the system because the job market and certain amount of jobs, they favor a certain type of curriculum. So
Sure.
having a single national curriculum, don't you think that would lead to a decrease in the inequality in the system and more equality of opportunity?
Having a which curriculum do you say?
Single national curriculum, one
As-
curriculum across the country. Instead of having multiple curriculums, having one curriculum across the country.
You mean to impose a single curriculum?
Yeah.
Well, but I think, again, it's like the discussion we were having about inequality. It depends on success in having diversity without having inequality. You seem to be saying that diversity inherently imposes inequality. I doubt it. It depends on the details.
Yeah, so what I was saying was that, for instance, the job market, the bureaucracy, most of the people in those positions are people who are probably getting benefited from the British system of education, which is still there in my country.
Sure.
And people who are being made to study the local curriculum, they are always at disadvantage. So probably this would reduce the.
Correct. So, but then you could say you want, by a practical standard, you don't want diversity then to become an instrument of inequality. So you want everyone to know whatever is necessary to be, for example, in the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. But it should be possible to combine that with some element of local intelligence. It's an empirical question. I think it's a very valid concern, but I don't see how one could answer it in a formulaic way. I think you'd have to have an anti-dogmatic response to it. Yes.
So, the industrial mass production, it has been, I believe, an outcome of immense amount of innovation. For instance, the steam engine, the electricity. So, how come, or at what point did this happen that this system, which benefited so much from innovation,
Which system?
the industrial mass production,
Yes.
it descended into a system which discourages innovation or encourages intellectual stability that you were just saying?
Uh-huh.
Isn't it counterproductive to the very system which was based on innovation?
What's counterproductive? I don't understand.
So, the system of industrial mass production,
Yes.
it benefited a lot from innovation such as the steam engine, electricity.
Yes.
So, why did it descend into a system that you were just saying discourages innovation or encourages intellectual stability? Isn't it counterproductive to the expansion of the system of
It consists, that's right, it consists in a stereotyped set of machines and capabilities. It's based, as I'm next going to argue, on command and control, on hierarchy, rigid specialization. There's a stark contrast between the supervision of tasks and the execution of tasks. And then there are highly specialized executory roles of execution. So all of that structure of command and control, of hierarchy and specialization is inimical to the culture of a radicalized knowledge economy. That's the point. And more generally, it's an instance of low trust. That is, the style of production embodied by conventional industry and the market order that accompanies it is a low trust order, expressed through command and control. Now then, the elite of the knowledge economy finds a world where people innovate collaboratively, flatten hierarchies among themselves. It's an elite world. It's not a world that is achieved, is accomplished in some socially inclusive form. They have this kind of democracy, in quotes, among themselves, but the mass of the people are not in it. Now, I've described this form of education as an elite, as general education. And of course, the European tradition is you have general education for the elites and you have vocational training for the masses. But here we would have to have a different understanding of the relation between general education and vocational training. Not that they're radically different, but they're on a continuum. So the standard model of vocational training in the world is the old German model, which was training that emphasized job-specific and machine-specific skills. You trained to be an electrician, a plumber, a steel worker, and you trained in the repertoire in a fixed repertoire of machines, like the 5 or 6 types of metal cutting lathes. Here it's a different idea, that the emphasis of practical training is on the higher order, the meta capabilities, flexible capabilities required for the use and the continuous adjustment of the numerically controlled machine tools which are central to the knowledge economy. So the result is that then vocational training, practical training is on a continuum with the imaginative skills required by this form of education that I earlier outlined, as opposed to the idea that there are fundamentally different kinds for different types of humanity in different parts of society. It's the same thing. It's the same spirit that rules in both the model of general education and the model of practical training. Now then, the second major requirement for an inclusive knowledge economy is the social or moral requirement. As I was just saying now, conventional industry is a low trust form of vanguard. Depends on this stark hierarchical contrast between the supervision and the execution of tasks. And the counterpart to this stark division between supervising and executing is high specialization among the executory tasks. So here we would have to have a fluid mixture of cooperation and competition, cooperative competition, among firms and within firms. An effacement of the sharp contrast between the definition of productive tasks and their execution. The execution of the productive tasks becomes then an ongoing redefinition, reinvention of the productive task in the course of implementing it. And the other side of that, then, is a relativization of the sharp contrast among the specialized executory roles. So it's exactly like the contrast that I suggested in an earlier class between the conventional infantry brigade and a special forces or guerrilla operation. And if we are to define the ambition by this military analogy, then the aim is for the force, in this case the productive force, to acquire the characteristics of the irregular force without losing its coherence and momentum. Now, of course, all of this depends on the accumulation of social capital, on associational density. And the question is how this accumulation of social capital is to be achieved. So you could say it's achieved by having a high energy democracy, which multiplies the occasions for people from different origins, from different parts of society, to do things together. Purpose, on the basis of shared purpose rather than of similar ascriptive origin. And it is achieved in the economy as a whole, in this knowledge economy that I've been describing, by the culture and practice of cooperative experimentalism. But there are also certain innovations in the character of civil society itself, civil society outside the market and outside the state, that would be powerful sources of social capital. And now let me describe two of these. One has to do with the provision of public services. So what we have in the world, in the whole world, by way of provision of public services, is what you could describe as an administrative Fordism. So I'm taking the term by analogy to industrial Fordism, conventional industry. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor, and very specialized and hierarchical relations of production. What I'm calling administrative Fordism is the provision of standardized low-quality public services. Low quality meaning of lower quality than the equivalent services that can be bought on the market by someone who has money, by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. That's what we have in the world as the dominant model of provision of public services. So we have the administrative counterpart to conventional industry. We don't have an administrative counterpart to the knowledge economy. And the only alternative to this administrative Fordism seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But of course, there's another alternative that is likely to become increasingly important in the course of the 20th century, of the 21st century. The alternative would be the following. The state would provide universal services to everyone, a minimum, a floor, a universal minimum of a public option in services. And the state would also operate at the ceiling in the development of the most complex and costly new services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state would partner with independent civil society in the competitive and experimentalist provision of public services, not for profit. Civil society would be organized through cooperatives of health professionals, of educators, who would participate together with the state as partners with the state in the provision of public services. And you could say this participation of civil society in experimentation with public services would be not only the most reliable way to enhance their quality, but it would also be the most powerful incitement to the self-organization of civil society outside the state. And the self-organization of civil society is a good in itself, because a disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. So the organization of civil society outside the state is a very powerful form of enhancement of agency. That's the basic idea. And the second initiative, the second social mechanism for the accumulation of social capital is the generalization of a principle of social service. So the general idea is this: every able-bodied adult should have at least two roles in society. Should have a role in the system of production and skilling, like education, and should have a role in helping other people beyond the boundaries of family selfishness. So take the case of military service in a republic. A republic cannot accept a mercenary army. The army should never be part of the nation paid for by the other parts to defend it. Because then in a class society, what you're going to have is an army of poor people to fight wars for rich people. The army must always be the nation in arms, the whole nation. And therefore, the Republican principle is insistence on conscription, universal conscription, everyone subject to military service, men and women, universally. But of course, most countries don't need all the young people of a certain age cohort, subject to military service. So then you could say, all of those exempt from military service because they're not needed become them subject to mandatory social service. And for a year or two of their lives, they have to serve the country, to build the country, say in another region, different from the region from which they come. And in that social service, where they would work in the areas that they're thinking of becoming professionals in, they would receive rudimentary military training to compose a reserve force that could be mobilized in a national defense emergency. So I described two principles, a principle of mandatory social service and a way of organizing the provision of public services by the state that are both designed to enhance the accumulation of social capital, social cohesion. By opposition to what we have in liberal social democracy, which then trusts to money transfers organized by the state as the only tangible basis of social solidarity. But money transfers organized by the state appear to be an adequate basis of social solidarity only against the background of a high level of ethnic, social, and religious homogeneity. As soon as the level of homogeneity is degraded, for example, by massive migratory flows, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. The only adequate basis of social cohesion is direct involvement of people in other people's lives, beyond the boundaries of taking care of their own families. So then if we go back to the knowledge economy, the idea of a knowledge economy for the many, the knowledge economy for the many is not a project that can flourish against a background of low trust. It is a high trust form of production. And then we have to have this idea that the disposition to cooperate and the ability to trust is not just an invariant fact about social life. It is a variable that is susceptible to institutional initiative. And I've just given you an example of two sets of initiatives that are designed to modify this variable, which then becomes the background of the knowledge economy for the many. Comments? Yes.
Two very quick questions. One is, why do we need like such a large militarily trained reserve in this decision? So obviously you said that with the mandatory civil service, people would also, the young people would also get some with mandatory civil service.
as a reserve force. As a not as the standing army, but as a reserve force. Because I think, this is another discussion which is beyond maybe beyond our immediate agenda, but in a world of armed states, war is a permanent possibility. These armed states are, and I believe that the existence of sovereign states is necessary to the development of humanity. Humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. And thus the majority of humanity is hostile to the idea of a world state. The soft globalism that prevails among the cosmopolitan elites of the world is rejected by the majority of humanity. I side with them. I take their position. I'm also against these cosmopolitan projects. Now, let me say one more word about this, because this is a question of great significance. It may have no immediate relation to our discussions here in political economy, but it has a powerful indirect relation. So, what is the point of the existence of different nations? What is the nature of the national difference? In ancient societies and societies around the world, to be, for example, to be a Roman was to live according to the customs of the ancient Romans. So the national difference had a tangible expression in these differences of customary life. Different gods, different customs, tangibly manifest. Now the nations of the world are on a voyage into becoming something else. They're becoming experiments in what you could call moral specialization within humanity. There's no natural way of organizing society. There are different ways of organizing it. And in principle, the goal of the nations, if one is to attribute them to them a goal, is to specialize in different forms of life. Liberal political theory has the idea that there can be a neutral framework of principles, of laws, which is neutral with respect to particular visions of the good, particular forms of life. I think, and I believe that most of humanity thinks, that this notion of neutrality is false, is an illusion. That no institutional framework is neutral among conflicting conceptions of the good. And moreover, that the pretense of neutrality is always adduced in favor of its opposite. The claim of neutrality is a claim made to entrench a particular set of customs or arrangements against attack. So it produces the opposite. Nevertheless, the illusory idea of neutrality has a kinship to another ideal which is valid and even indispensable. A form of social life should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and above all, it should be corrigible. That is, it shouldn't be something that imprisons us into a form of social life from which we can then not escape. So contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate liberal idea of neutrality. That's what I would say. Now, on this voyage then, from being porous, tangible worlds organized around shared customs and gods, to being a form of moral specialization within humanity in the future, an accident happens. So the different nations of the world are in struggle with one another, ideological and practical emulation, short of war. And they scour the whole world to discover what works, to achieve power and force and wealth. So, for example, Japan, in the middle of the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration, a faction of the Japanese elite seizes power and it says, we have to reform in order not to be conquered by the Western powers. To reform, we have to sacrifice part of ourselves. We have to study what part of the institutions and arrangements of Prussia, for example, we have to accept in our country. So they eviscerate part of their tangible collective identity. They hollow it out, and they combine something which they import from other countries in the world with what they maintain from their tradition. So there's this hollowing out of the collective identity. From that there then results the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism, which is that two nations live side by side and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike and they want to be different. So it's this impotent rage for difference in the presence of the waning of actual difference, which is the uniquely poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. So then we have three positions in the world. We have the reactionary, autarkic nationalism, which says, let's restore the ancient differences. We have the liberal cosmopolitanism and globalism, which says, let's suppress the differences and let's converge to the same set of institutions and practice. And we have the third position, which is the position I want to defend, which is that we shouldn't suppress the differences. Differences are not the problem. Differences are the solution. We should equip the differences. We should give the nations of the world the institutional instruments that they need to create new difference. Because actual difference is not as dangerous as imagined or willed difference. They should be actually different. They should have high energy democracies. They should have experimentalist knowledge economies so that they can create new difference, and humanity will be enriched by this explosion of difference. It's the opposite of the liberal concern. Difference is the problem. We have to adjudicate. We have to find a neutral framework. I affirm difference is not the problem. Difference is the solution. And difference is the response to this poisonous character of the contemporary nationalism. So it's against that background that I then developed these arguments. Now, the states are armed. The states threaten one another. The elites of some of these states have a fantasy about war, that war only requires a tiny professional army that can manipulate technological instruments. Real war is never going to be like that. There can be a moment of this action from remote, but there's no war without physical presence. War requires the engagement of the nation in its defense. And that's the reason why you can have a small, highly trained force as the front line, but you have to have a vast reserve in the background that can be mobilized in a national emergency. And that was the reason for this suggestion that you say everyone is subject to mandatory social service, and in mandatory social service receives the minimum of technical training required to belong to this reserve force that can be mobilized when necessary. That's the idea. Yes?
Do you worry that the kind of democratic experimentalism that you favor could contradict some of the aims of economy and social service?
You have to speak louder, please.
Could a experimentalist
Yes.
democracy try to invalidate or go against the goals of an inclusive knowledge economy?
Of course it could. Of course it could. So nothing is going to prevent these experiments, these institutional experiments, from going off the rails. So, and this is another way in which these ideas differ from the projects of liberal political theory, because liberal political theory has always this notion of like a perpetual motion machine. Here's a fail-safe system that will prevent things from breaking down. There's nothing. I agree with the principle of the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who said, the business of the future is to be dangerous. And there's no institutional order which is going to cancel that out. But we think that the best security again, that is to enhance the power of agency of common humanity. That's the democratic and experimentalist bet. To make people secure in a haven of safeguards against oppression and of powers. And then let the storm of innovation and conflict rage around them while they're secure in the haven. The distortion of social democracy is it has only the talk about the haven. It has no talk about the storm. But the storm needs to be arranged. The storm doesn't happen spontaneously. That's the basic idea. Yes? Louder.
In terms of strategy, how would this vision compete with existing ideologies in the society? For instance, the idea that the state should provide public services because people pay taxes and they demand.
But compete with which ideologies do you have in mind?
Just one is that the state should provide public services because people pay taxes for them, so they expect.
Yes, and the state should provide public services. That's what I argued in my example, that the state should provide a universal minimum. The state should operate also at the ceiling in the development of the new service, the costliest services, the frontier of public service. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state doesn't have to act alone. The state can invite civil society to act with it, not for profit, through cooperatives. That's the basic idea. It's not an idea of diminishing the provision of public service, it's an idea of expanding them.
I agree. I'm just wondering whether, I don't know, like what would incentivize civil society to want to do this with the state, as opposed to what maybe happens now in some countries where civil society does provide some form of service, but only in some, because of the anger against the state. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a profound question, because I'm now describing the background to the knowledge economy in a maximalist form, right? Everything that would be convenient to tap its potential, its underutilized potential. But of course, no real society would undertake all of these changes just in the hope that it would produce a particular economic advantage. If you take all of these changes together, they're revolutionary. They're changes in the character of human life. So you have to think that these changes would have to be valued for their own sake and not just for their economic advantages. So the object of these last changes that I described in this organization of society is the organization of society as a form of power, of empowerment of the ordinary man and woman, valued for its own sake. It has these advantages as a background to a high trust knowledge economy, but it's not because of them that we could undertake this. We undertake them because they serve a host of other purposes. Like this is, as it were, an additional benefit. But I don't see how we would embark on this trajectory just for the sake of its economic benefits. Yes.
I'm wondering if these type of changes occur as a response, a reaction to other nations being competitive or other ideologies that are competing with the current status quo.
Of course. But our situation now in the 21st century is, in this respect, quite different from the situation in the 20th century, because in the 20th century, there were these transformative ideologies: communism, fascism, right and left. We've inherited the ideological vocabulary of the 20th century, but our situation now is not that there is this multitude of attractive alternatives. It's the opposite, right? That's the main situation. There are no alternatives. So we pretend that there are all these divisions, but where are they? I mean, there's an orthodox position in the world. If you ask, what is the current orthodoxy? It's not so easy to answer that question. So there was historical social democracy, then there's neoliberalism, and there's what you could call social liberalism. So one way to characterize the present orthodoxy is to say neoliberalism attacked historical social democracy as being unfair and costly. And historical social democracy lost its traditional base, its productive base in conventional industry. That's our subject here. And it hasn't recovered from the loss of its base. The left-leaning parties had as their core historical constituency organized labor, the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, especially in conventional industry. That base has been destroyed. The industrial proletariat, Marx's favorite agent, is now a shrinking percentage of the population. It's not, it doesn't plausibly speak for the universal interests of humanity. It is increasingly seen by the other parts of the population and ultimately comes to see itself as just one more special interest, not as the bearer of the universal interests of humanity as Marx thought it would be. So neoliberalism collides with historical social democracy. What results from that collision is the diminished, eviscerated form of social democracy that you could call social liberalism. Social liberalism has a better claim to be considered the universal orthodoxy than neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was just the instrument that produced this liberalized version of social democracy. So the project of the elites on both sides of the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic world, is now to produce a combination of American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. That's the orthodoxy. And what are the alternatives in the world? The alternatives are mainly some form of authoritarian, despotic state socialism under various pretentious ideological vocabularies that conceal its nature, right? So our situation is dramatically different from the situation in the 20th century. It's not a situation of all these alternatives that are around us that are attracting. It's that there's nothing attracting us. It's a situation of no exit, no alternative, the dictatorship of no alternatives, as I've called it. And it's against this background that we're now having this discussion about the alternative directions in political economy, because the alternatives in political economy would be one of the principal focal points for finding an alternative. The problem is in the way in which I'm now discussing it, in this maximalist version, what's unreal about it is it's quite obvious as I develop the discussion that no real society would embark on this transformation just for the sake of its economic benefits. So this is like a small-scale version of an alternative ideological project. Now, that then leads to the discussion of the third element in the background of this knowledge economy for the many. And the third element is the most important. It's more important than the cognitive educational background. It's more important than the social moral background. The third element is the legal and institutional transformation that would be required to sustain this knowledge economy for the many. After all, the key analytical premise, as I insisted on from the very beginning in the first class, was a market order has no single natural and necessary form. So all of this discussion of vanguard and rearguard, labor and capital, finance and the real economy, is about the alternative forms of the market economy. So looked at from that standpoint, what are the key steps that would be necessary to create an institutional background, a legal and institutional background, hospitable to an inclusive knowledge economy? And so I want to say, in the spirit of all the rest of our discussions here, that they would begin very modestly, and then they would progress. So, and just for the sake of conceptual clarification, let me distinguish 3 steps in this legal institutional evolution. In the first step, the paramount objective is to expand access to productive resources and opportunities in favor of a much larger cast of economic agents. And specifically, 2 sets of economic agents. First of all, the small and medium-sized enterprises of the economic rearguard, of the productive rearguard. That is, the businesses that are pushed back to they're furthest away from the frontier of productivity. Traditional family business, undercapitalized business, the whole rearguard of the economy. That's the first addressee of the initiative. And the second is the multitude of autonomous economic agents, because now we have in the world, in all the major economies of the world, a huge proportion of the labor force that has no stable relation with business organizations. There's typically autonomous service providers, who aren't employees of any business organization. So what we would want then would be to expand access for them for an elevation of capabilities and economic powers and opportunities. So credit, practice, capacity for the small and medium-sized enterprises and for the autonomous or semi-autonomous economic agents, to lift them up. And what is the most significant historical comparison? It's the comparison to 19th century agricultural extension. It's the comparison that I invoked also in the first class, the formation of the United States. So the way in which the Americans democratized the agricultural market and began to lift up the family farmer and to create a family scale farming with entrepreneurial attributes that became the most productive form of agriculture in the world at that time. So in this first stage, the crucial elements are, first, the expansion of access to credit, to skills or capabilities, and to ideas, to science, given practical form, as in the 19th century agricultural extension, based on the land-grant colleges coming to the door of the family farmer. Then, to discover practically what works best, what works and what doesn't work, to identify the successful experiments, and to disseminate them. So, empowerment, experimentalism, diffusion in this first step. It's a lift-up operation to turn to the periphery, to the rear guard, and to lift it up in the same spirit in which the Americans lifted up the 19th century agricultural system. Then you can imagine that out of this lift-up operation, there begins to emerge at a second stage a new architecture of the market economy, characterized by strategic coordination or partnership between the government, national and local governments, and the producer, the small and medium-sized firms of the rear guard or the autonomous economic agents, and the government, through an intermediate level of support centers. So they wouldn't be all instituting a unitary trade and industrial policy. They would be trying different things out. And among these economic agents, small and medium-sized firms, or individualized economic agents, cooperative competition. So they would both compete against one another and cooperate, achieving economies of scale through cooperation, as the Americans did in the agricultural example. So now you can generalize the comparative basis of this idea. The comparative basis are, broadly speaking, there are two models available in the world of business-government relations. There's the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government. And there's the Northeast Asian model, as in the Northeast Asian tiger economies, of the formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. Now, it's sometimes more top-down than other places. It's more top-down in South Korea than it is in Taiwan, for example. But it always has more or less this character. So this model that I'm describing as the architecture that begins to emerge at the second stage is by opposition to those two available models of government-business relations. It's not the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and it's not the Northeast Asian model of imposition of a unitary trade and industrial policy top down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. On the vertical axis of government-business relations, it is decentralized, participatory, competitive, experimentalist, and on the horizontal axis among the producers, it's characterized by the fluid mixture of cooperation and competition. So it is the beginning of a reinvention of the market economy. Now we imagine a third stage, far into the future. The central idea in the third stage is the idea that I previewed before of the capital auction. So we start with the basic idea. The market economy will not be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. There won't be one master mechanism of decentralized allocation of access to the resources and opportunities of production. There will be alternative systems of property and contract and of capital allocation coexisting experimentally in the same market order. So, for example, we'll still have a place for the old 19th century unified property right, because as I observed, the absolute property right of the 19th century has a priceless advantage. It allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk something that no one else believes in, without having to negotiate with a series of stakeholders who would have to lift their vetoes. So we would always want that to be one of the forms of decentralized allocation of property, of capital. But we wouldn't want it to be the only form. So at the opposite end of the spectrum is the idea of the capital auction. So we place the productive resources of society, technology and liquid capital, in funds. They're not instruments of discretionary allocation by government. They're independently managed. And we organize these funds according to different paradigms of their time horizon, their risk profile, in order to discover experimentally what works best or what doesn't work. And these funds basically lend the productive resources to the capital takers, teams of workers, entrepreneurs, and technologists who are able to assure them of the highest rate of return. So we might even say in the future, the base of governmental finance at some point might cease to be taxation and might become the underlying rate of interest. The rate of interest is the rate that society charges for the use of its productive capital. And so there's this rotating capital auction, this auction of the means of production. So that's why I say such a system might be described as capitalism without capital. Or, I'm sorry, capitalism without capitalists. Because we have capital and it's auctioned off, but we don't have the capitalists. And I pointed out to you in an earlier class that a peculiarity of this thought experiment is that although it might seem to some to be very radical, an orthodox finance theorist might say it actually describes what already exists, because their claim is that that's what a perfectly competitive finance market already does. It already auctions off capital to its most efficient users. If he's not the most efficient user, he's not going to continue to be the owner for very long. This was, by the way, the theory under which the finance theorists defended the so-called spontaneous privatization in post-Yeltsin Russia. They said it doesn't matter what bandits initially acquire the resources of the Soviet state. In the long run, it's going to end up in the hands of whoever uses it best. That's the magic of the capital markets. According to them, it was this capital auction. So you can see it either as a utopia or as a description of what already exists. But the point of setting it up as an institutional arrangement is to say, we won't rely on the dogma, we'll test it to see if it really is the same thing. Now let me say one final thing before I invite your comments. So I've described the requirements for an inclusive knowledge economy. And I've said there are educational or cultural requirements, there are social moral requirements, the accumulation of social capital, and above all, there are legal institutional requirements. Now you can ask the following question. Under what conditions in culture and in politics is it more or less likely that these requirements will be satisfied? And I would say there are basically two sets of conditions that bear on the answer to this question. So first, the radicalization of experimentalism in culture, not just education, the experimentalist attitude in culture. And one way to make explicit the theme that I'm trying to bring out is this. I go back to the idea. There are two sets of moves that we have in society. There are the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. Let's call them the routine moves. And then there are the exceptional or transformative moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of social or personal crisis, we challenge and change pieces of this framework. Now, what does it mean to say that there would be a radicalization of experimentalism? What it means is to say that the distance between these two sets of moves will narrow, so that the moves by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework will arise more naturally and continuously out of the ordinary moves that we make within the framework. That's what an experimentalist culture is. So we won't have the sense that for most of the time we're sleepwalking through these routines where we're taking everything for granted, and from time to time we wake up and we challenge and change. No, that's not what human life will be like. The character of our routine experience will change and will become closer to the transformative experience. So I don't know whether we discussed here, someone raised the example of the Kuhnian idea of science. Paradigm shifts, normal science and revolutionary science. So the analogy would be to say, normal science acquires some of the characteristics of revolutionary science. We don't have this idea that there are these geniuses on the mountaintop, like Newton and Einstein, and they periodically change the paradigms. And then in between, in the long periods in between, everyone else carries out the instructions under the paradigm that the genius invented. Because now the experience of genius is diffused throughout humanity. And our ordinary experience takes on some of the attributes of this exceptional experience of invention, of transformation. So that would be the cultural condition, the radicalization of the experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. And the political condition is the creation of a high-energy democracy, which is a democracy that facilitates the repeated practice of structural reform, that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, and that therefore overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. That's what I understand a high-energy democracy to be. And a high-energy democracy depends on at least 3 sets of institutional innovations. First, a heightening of the temperature of politics so that we don't have to choose between Madison and Mussolini, and we can say, contrary to the premises of conservative statecraft and political science, there is not a choice between a cold institutional politics and a hot anti-institutional politics, Caesarism. We can have a politics that is both hot and institutional. It depends on the details. The rules of voting, whether the voting is optional or mandatory, the electoral regimes, the rules governing the relation between money and political activity, and the rules governing the access of the political parties and the social movements to the means of mass communication. Then the second set of innovations, crucial to a high-energy democracy, has to do with the pace of politics rather than the temperature. Temperature is the level of mobilization. And what's at stake is very clearly shown by the American constitutional arrangements. The American constitutional arrangements present this problem in its sharpest form because they are based on an association between the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power in the state and the conservative principle of the slowing down in politics. That's Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And the Americans think, mistakenly, that the liberal principle and the conservative principle are naturally and necessarily combined, that they're indissolubly linked. But they're not indissolubly linked. They're linked by design and intention to limit the transformative uses of politics. So take the American presidential regime as the terrain in which to illustrate the point. Imagine that we reaffirm the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but we repudiate the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And how do we do this given the American arrangements? We say, if there is a stalemate between the two political branches, between the president and the Congress, either branch would unilaterally have the constitutional prerogative to dissolve the impasse by calling early elections. But the branch that would exercise the constitutional prerogative of calling the early elections would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. So the elections would always be bilateral for both branches, but it would be provoked by one branch, but bilateral for both branches. And by this simple device, you could turn the presidential regime on its head and turn it into a motive for the acceleration of politics. Illustrating the point that small institutional changes can have drastic effects. Now, the third set of institutional innovations have to do with the relation between power to the center and power to the periphery. So the conventional conservative view is that there is a pendular relation, a hydraulic model. Either power goes to the center or it goes to the periphery. But in fact, you can have more of both, depending on how you shape the constitutional allocation of divided and combined powers. So how do you give federalism an experimentalist twist? Say there are two stages. In one stage, the instrument of experimentalism in the federation is cooperation. vertical cooperation among the three levels, federal, state, and municipal, and horizontal cooperation among the states and the municipalities. But in a second stage, there would be what I would call wide divergence. So you say, if you insist that all parts of the federation have at the same time the same right of divergence, the right of divergence is necessarily very limited. But you can say a certain state could apply for a right of very wide divergence exceptionally. And of course, it would have to be vetted by the political branches of government and by the courts to prevent it being an instrument of persecution or discrimination, of course. And what's the idea behind this? The idea is that as society goes down a certain road, through strong initiatives by the central government, it hedges its bets and allows parts of itself to generate counter-models of the national future. So there's a kind of dialectic of alternatives in the national life. Say, we want this, but we were going to allow part of us to try something else out. Not as an abstraction, as a doctrinal abstraction, but as a practical form of social life. And in that way, you can have more of both, more central action and more experimental diversity. So what I want to say is that in addition to a radicalization of the experimentalist impulse in culture, those three sets of requirements are more likely to be satisfied to the extent that democracy approaches this ideal of experimentalism, of democratic experimentalism. In culture and in politics, in the organization of politics and in the organization of the radicalization of the experimentalist impulse and the creation of a high-energy democracy. Now, of course, you see that what is paradoxical about this whole presentation is the following. In my exposition here, I'm constantly doubling the bet because there are these requirements, then behind the requirements stand these conditions that make them more likely to be satisfied. And so each layer is more radical than the one before it. So, but this is the nature of social life, right? It's not that there's a system and then we unpack the system into its parts and we say we either realize all of it or nothing. We embark on a certain path for a combination of reasons, and then we discover that there's more at stake than we thought at the beginning. It's the discovery of a universe of possibilities, and it's therefore part of the experience of escape from the situation of no alternatives I was describing before, the situation of the 21st century. We thought there were no alternatives, but there are alternatives. We just have to create them little by little, part by part. And then we'll see that each level of breakthrough leads to a further possible level of breakthrough, and it depends on us how far we want to go, because of course the fundamental transformation is not the transformation of society, but the transformation of ourselves. So this is a good place to stop and to ask for your comments. Yes?
Expand on the third stage of the legal institutional requirements, which are that?
The third stage is the stage in which we say now we're going to take to the hilt. We're going to take seriously the idea that a market economy has no natural form. So the conventional idea of economic rationality is freedom to recombine factors of production within a framework of production and exchange that is itself unchallenged. Now we're going to radicalize that. We're going to say we won't have freedom just to recombine factors of production within an unchanged framework. We'll have freedom to change the framework. And we won't change it all of a sudden in some revolutionary form. We'll change it as we go along, bit by bit. That's the basic idea. And now, what is the most crucial way in which we could change it? Going back to remarks I made in the first class. So remember, in the first class I said, even at the most abstract level, the idea of a market has two dimensions. One dimension is absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. Absoluteness in time, perpetual control, a right of alienation, and right to transmit by inheritance, and absoluteness in scope. And the conventional idea of the market is that these two dimensions of the market are indissolubly connected. And I say they're not only are they not indissolubly connected, but they obviously contradict each other. Because one of the ways in which we might radicalize the absolute amount of decentralization is by qualifying the absoluteness of the control that each of the agents has over the resources at his command. I mean, it's a simple example is like time sharing. So the capital auction that I'm describing and that I'm provocatively labeling capitalism without capitalists is a system in which the productive resources of society are made available to their most effective users temporarily. But no one has permanent control of the productive resources of society. It has to be paid for. And this payment could be described as the rate of interest. It's what society charges for the use of its productive resources. So you say you can use them. You present here a track record of your achievements of a group. We'll give you a chance. Then someone else comes and says, I can use them better than he does, so I'll bid them away from him. That's the fundamental idea.
I think my question is, how do you have a vision for how you protect the capital auction process from being captured by special interests?
Well, that's why there's this relation to democracy, right? To a high energy democracy. Because in principle, the idea is the democratic institutions observe this and they see which of these funds works best, which paradigm works best. And you say, well, those will have more of and this will have less of. So it's an ongoing experiment. But of course, at any time there's the temptation to convert temporary advantage into vested right. And that's this phenomenon of the capture by the interests. So there are basically two devices developed in the course of the 20th century to deal with this problem. One device is that will have this soft state, which will be liberal, and will have certain safeguards against obvious capture, but it can easily be penetrated by the interests, like the United States. And then we'll have another device in which the state is in the hands of an elite, a vanguardist elite, like the Communist Party in China or in the Soviet Union, and say, we speak for the interests of the whole society. And of course, the problem is then they speak for their own interests, in the first place, their power interests. So there's no agent. So the alternative to this soft state on the one hand and to the authoritarian vanguard on the other would be the radicalization of democracy. More conflict, more dialectic. That's a third category of response, which is I'm trying to fill up in this exposition. But that's the way in which that debate would go. But it's quite different from saying in the Madisonian scheme that there's this perpetual motion machine. And that you have this scheme and it will guarantee you against the experiment going off the rails. That's not the nature of history. So there's no, the only guarantee is the deepening of the powers of agency of ordinary humanity. It's more people with their eyes open, more people with power, more conflicts of interest, more stuff, more dialogue, more struggle. The more the better. That's the spirit. So we have 2 weeks to think about this. We didn't really have an adequate discussion of this, so I think I should begin the next class before going on to capital and labor by inviting your comments on this argument. Have a good break. Yes. Yes.
Talking about the heightening of like the temperature of fault, right?
Yes.